I'll honor Sarah in my own way. I'm going to go to Sarah's favorite steakhouse with my mom. Even my mom, who is weak from a cold, will cheer up after eating meat.
Despite it being the day of our beloved daughter's funeral, John didn't show up. After calling him multiple times, I finally got through, only for him to say something completely unacceptable. Does he not understand who's responsible for Sarah's death? No matter what I say to John, who lacks the essential qualities of a person and a parent, it won't make any difference. Each word from him only deepens my anger and resentment toward him. And I'm not the only one whose anger is rising. My dad feels the same way.
Now, let's send him to hell.
Without John's presence, we sent Sarah off to heaven peacefully. Yes, it was John's turn next. I'll make sure to send him to hell. No, I'll drag him down myself. I'm Julie, a housewife in my 30s. My daughter, Sarah, just turned 3.
Mommy, I want to go to the big pool again.
The pool? Yeah. The pool is fun, isn't it? Our family consists of Sarah, my husband John, and me, and we love going on outings. Since Sarah was born, John has come up with fun places to visit almost every week. But now that Sarah is 3, our happy little family has started to fall apart.
What? You want to go to that big pool again? Oh no. Let's go to the museum instead. They've got huge dinosaurs there.
As I feared, John wasn't thrilled about going to the pool. Here we go. I sighed softly. Not long ago, if Sarah said she wanted to go to that pool, John would have happily taken her right away. Lately, though, instead of following Sarah's wishes, he's been steering us toward where he wants to go.
I want to see the dinosaurs.
Sarah, still so young, easily changed her mind. If Sarah's okay with it, the museum's fine too, I guess. But I couldn't help feeling bitter. So, are we not going to the pool anymore? I asked quietly, and John nodded as if it were the most obvious thing in the world.
Yeah, that's right. That pool was indoors, so it was great for the winter, but we went a ton when she was under 3. That should be enough.
Another one of Sarah's favorite spots was off the table. Why? Because it wasn't a bargain anymore. Because the pool is free for children up to 3 years old. John loves anything that's a good deal. He always gets vouchers, and he gets 3 or 4 sample items by himself. When we eat out, he picks restaurants where we can use coupons. And even if he really wants something on the menu, he'll settle for whatever's discounted. I used to think he was just a frugal guy with good money sense. But ever since Sarah was born, his penny pinching has gone into overdrive, to the point where he's just plain cheap.
Kids get so many free deals, you know? Let's make sure Sarah has a ton of experiences while we can.
John would look for places that are free or super cheap for kids and take us there. We traveled by plane. We went up to the observation deck of a skyscraper, visited aquariums and zoos, and made so many memories. I was grateful for it, but I never thought that once Sarah turned 3 and those discounts stopped, we'd suddenly stop going altogether. While Sarah is still little, it's not so bad. Even if we can't go to the pool or amusement parks she loves, there are still plenty of fun and affordable places and restaurants to go. But once she starts elementary school, the deals John loves so much pretty much disappear.
Come on, we're going to the park. Hurry up and get ready. Did you pack lunch, honey? Not yet?
Our outings were now limited to parks with no admission fees. After all the places we've taken her to, it's just unfair to stop going once she starts school. After Sarah went to bed, I talked to John. At least once a month, can't we take her somewhere she really wants to go?
Are we having this conversation again? What was the point of taking her to all those places before then? We let her have tons of fun while it was cheap. That's enough. She's had a lifetime of treats already.
John was always so stubborn, never willing to compromise. Having gotten used to the cheaper toddler rates, paying full price now seemed like an unbearable waste to him. It felt like he was satisfied as long as he'd squeezed out every deal while he could. His frugality just kept growing.
Hey, is Sarah sick or something?
One day, when John came home from work, he glanced at Sarah, who was lying down. Yeah, she has a fever and had to stay home from school. She just took her medicine and went to sleep. I put my finger to my lips, signaling John to keep quiet so he wouldn't wake her. John leaned over to look at Sarah's pained face. But then, to my shock, I heard him click his tongue in annoyance.
Don't take her to the doctor for just a cold.
John suddenly raised his voice. I quickly grabbed his arm and pulled him away from Sarah to avoid stressing her even more. Speaking in a low voice, I confronted him. Sarah's sleeping. Keep it down. She has a fever, remember?
Why do I always have to listen to you? You're the one who betrayed me first.
What? John didn't bother hiding his irritation, his right leg bouncing restlessly.
I told you not to take her to the doctor anymore.
That's when it hit me. It's true, John had been lamenting that he couldn't take Sarah to the doctor anymore. Starting this year, Sarah is no longer eligible for free medical assistance. It was definitely a loss, but it was because John's income had gone up and we no longer qualified for the aid. I remembered him joking bitterly about it. That's just ridiculous, right? Going to the doctor and going on outings are two completely different things. Making Sarah suffer through a sickness just because we have to pay for healthcare now is too cruel.
Colds get better with rest. You're making a big deal out of nothing. If the medicine worked and she was bouncing back, I wouldn't mind. But look, she's still in bed. What was the point of paying all that money to see a doctor?
His tone was intimidating, and I was left speechless. He was using his booming voice to force me into submission. I wanted to argue, but I knew that would only make John angrier. More than anything, I just wanted him to be quiet. When I didn't respond, John looked satisfied, like he'd won.
See? There's no point in pointless doctor visits. People like you, with no brains, just put a burden on the healthcare system. A cold gets better with rest. A cut will heal if you spit on it. Don't spoil Sarah.
John's words sounded so self-righteous, but just last year, he'd rushed Sarah to the doctor at the slightest sign of a fever. Of course, that was because the visits were free, and it was cheaper than buying over-the-counter medicine.
Man, getting a raise sure is a double-edged sword. Working harder just feels like a loss. I wish I could have had them adjust my salary just right, so we could still get free healthcare for Sarah. Maybe half my pay in cash under the table or something?
That's not possible.
I know that, obviously. I'm joking. You never get my jokes, and you're as rigid as my company.
John scoffed and looked down on me with contempt. When did we stop being equals?
Hey, how about you start working too? You're just lazing around while Sarah's at school, right? Instead of thinking about wasting money on trips and doctor visits.
I'm currently a stay-at-home mom. John switched jobs when Sarah was born. When I quit my job during my pregnancy, John confidently promised to make enough for both of us. With his new job, his income increased a lot, and it was John who asked me to support the household as a stay-at-home mom. So, when he spoke as if I had been slacking off all this time, I was irritated.
Well, since you've been out of the workforce for a while, you probably can only get an easy job. But hey, you could at least make enough to cover Sarah's steak, right? Gotta love those all-you-can-eat steakhouses.
He's the one making the money, so he's the boss. He who earns the money decides how the money is spent. I could tell Don thought that even if I started working, I wouldn't be able to match his income, and he looked down on me for it. Maybe his job change was a mistake. Sure, his income went up, but he'd become overbearing. I was the one who encouraged him to change his job, and I know he struggled in the beginning with the new environment. Fine, I'll work too. Being pushed to go back to work was actually convenient for me. Every time I took Sarah out on a trip, John would glare at me and scold me for wasting money. Even getting some spending money from my dad made John resentful. If I could start working again and earn my own income, I could finally give Sarah the experiences she wanted without worrying. So I returned to work, but things didn't go as smoothly as I'd hoped.
Sarah's off school again? Must be nice, you know? You get to skip work with her. I'm so jealous.
On the third day back at work, Sarah caught a cold. Just as she got better, her school had the flu outbreak and had to close temporarily. I felt terrible for already causing trouble at my new jobs.
Are you really making enough to cover the steak with all that time off?
Don't worry. I'll still take her to a steakhouse or even the pool if she wants. I could feel my face contorting with frustration. Unfazed by my glare, John made an absurd suggestion.
Well then, let's go to the all-you-can-eat steakhouse. Let's invite my parents too.
I clenched my teeth so hard it hurt.
You hang out with your dad, but you barely spend any time with my parents. You'd better use your first paycheck to take care of them, okay?
I was so furious I couldn't speak. And I didn't want Sarah, who was in the next room, to hear us arguing. I just couldn't bring myself to start a fight. No, I'm not going.
Fine, whatever. It's probably too expensive for 4 adults and a little kid anyway.
The reason I didn't want to go wasn't because of the cost or because I didn't want to be nice to his parents. It was because I realized that I couldn't stand John anymore. I started thinking about divorce and was planning to talk to my dad, Michael, about it when, once again, Sarah came down with a cold. During parenting, I often feel the frustration of not being able to do things as I want. Even though Sarah only had a mild cough and slight fever, I ended up catching it while caring for her, and now I'm the one with a high fever. It's common for kids to have mild symptoms while the parents get knocked out by the same illness. Hey Sarah, are you okay? It seemed like her fever had gone up at night. When I noticed her dazed expression and touched her, she felt burning hot. She has a really high fever. She was fine during the day. Seeing her unfocused eyes, I got a sinking feeling that I should take her to the hospital immediately. But it was the first day of a long weekend, and it was late at night.
Wait, you really want to take her to the hospital now? Isn't that a bit much for just a fever?
I asked John for help, but his response was exactly what I expected.
If you're taking her to the hospital, can't it wait until the weekend's over? If we go now, it's going to cost extra for the holiday or late night fees, right? A cold will get better with rest.
It's as if John didn't even see Sarah. Sarah wasn't even complaining about her discomfort. She was already slipping into a dazed state. Even when I called out to her, her response was faint. Just take her. I don't care about the money. I'll pay for everything. Please, take her to the hospital. I wanted to carry her there myself, but I felt too weak. As much as I hated begging the man I was thinking of divorcing, I couldn't afford pride when it came to Sarah.
Fine, I'll go.
After pleading desperately, John reluctantly agreed. They'll probably diagnose her with a cold, give her something to bring the fever down, and we'll come back. John will be angry, but I don't care. I'm leaving him anyway. If he makes a fuss about wasting money, I'll throw the cash right in his face. These thoughts ran through my mind as I closed my eyes. But after a short while, I heard hurried footsteps approaching. It was too soon for them to have returned from the hospital. It was John who rushed into the room. Seeing his pale face, a chill ran down my spine.
Something's wrong with Sarah.
In that moment, everything fell apart. Sarah was only 7, just 7 years old. The little girl, so full of hope for her future, is no longer with us. On the night Sarah had that high fever, John didn't take her to the hospital. He decided she'd be fine and just let her sleep. But her condition worsened quickly, and Sarah passed away in the blink of an eye. This must be a bad dream. I couldn't even bring myself to blame John. I couldn't accept the reality of it. My dad has been running around, taking care of everything, while I feel like I'm watching it all happen to someone else. Even though Sarah's funeral is about to happen, it still doesn't feel real.
Julie, I know it's hard, but you need to stay strong. Today is an important day to say goodbye to Sarah.
My dad's words snapped me out of my daze. If Sarah is watching me from somewhere, she won't be able to rest in peace if I'm like this. As her mother, I want to do everything I can for her, one last time. Thank you, Dad. You're right. If I cry, it'll only make Sarah worry.
Yes, and your mom is in heaven too. She'll be there to look after Sarah, her first grandchild. By the way, could you try calling John again? I've been trying over and over, but I can't get through.
John, feeling overwhelmed after Sarah's death, went back to his parents' house. I didn't mind. I hadn't felt the need for him to be with me anyway. My dad, though, seemed puzzled by the distance between us as a couple. But losing his grandchild and dealing with everything, he didn't have time to ask for details. Just as my dad said, I looked around and there was no sign of John. John's parents were not there either. I kept thinking over and over, what if we had gone to the hospital that night? John must be suffering too. Maybe he's also emotionally shattered to be here. But still, it felt wrong for Sarah's father, John, to be absent from her farewell. I tried calling John's phone several times. Each time, it just kept ringing with no answer. After about a dozen attempts, I was about to give up when finally he picked up.
How many times are you gonna call? It's creepy.
I had been worrying about how to approach John, knowing he was likely devastated, but it seemed my concern was unnecessary. His voice was sharp and dripping with annoyance. I raised my voice in response. John, where are you? Sarah's funeral has already started. Hearing me, my dad came closer, gesturing to ask if I had finally gotten through to John. I nodded, and my dad leaned in, trying to gauge the situation.
Yeah, no can do.
John's words were cold, barely pausing as he continued.
Mom has a cold, so I brought her to the hospital.
What?
My dad froze. Unaware that my dad was listening, John kept going.
The funeral, it could have been kept simple, but I'm sure Michael's making it a big deal. Is that really for Sarah? Or is it just for his pride? What a waste.
My dad stood there, stunned, as if stabbed in the heart. He couldn't believe the words coming from John, whom he thought was drowning in grief. Even I, who had given up expecting anything from John, found his cruelty hard to accept. I lost any desire to convince him to attend the funeral. So you ignored Sarah. But you're rushing your mom to the hospital, right? I couldn't help but throw in a sarcastic remark.
My mom's old. She's not like a kid who can just sleep off a cold.
But Sarah, I started, but John cut me off, raising his voice even louder.
I said I'm sorry. I've been reflecting, okay? I'm hurting too. Stop acting like you're the only one suffering.
No matter what I said, it wouldn't reach John. As a person, as a father, he was missing something essential. All I felt was growing hatred, wounded by his heartlessness.
I'll honor Sarah in my own way. I'm going to go to Sarah's favorite steakhouse with my mom. Even my mom, who is weak from a cold, will cheer up after eating meat. Oh, and just tell Michael that I'm too grief-stricken and bedridden, so I can't make it.
As I stood there speechless, my dad gently patted my shoulder. Shaking his head, he silently urged me not to engage with John anymore. He took the phone from my hand and ended the call. I wanted to curse John out, but the words wouldn't come, and I felt a bitter frustration. I wanted to cry for Sarah, but instead, the tears came from my anger toward John.
There's no need to cry over someone like him. First, we'll send Sarah off properly. Then we'll make him cry all he wants.
The fire of anger burned in my dad's eyes. It finally dawned on me that I wasn't carrying the grief of losing Sarah or the anger toward John alone. Without John's presence, we were able to send Sarah off to heaven peacefully.
Now, let's send him to hell.
Yes, it was John's turn next. I'll make sure to send him to hell. No, I'll drag him down myself. After taking his bereavement leave, John returned to work from his parents' house. He walked in with a slight hunch, dragging his feet, but forcing a half smile on the right side of his face. He played the role of the grieving father, trying to soldier on despite his loss.
Sorry for taking time off so suddenly.
John apologized as soon as he entered his department. His forced smile was painfully obvious. Everyone around him seemed unsure how to react, and the atmosphere turned awkward.
Yeah, sorry for being away so long.
John called out to a nearby colleague as he made his way to his desk.
Hope things didn't fall behind while I was out. I'll work hard to make up for it.
Pretending to be full of energy, John slumped heavily into his chair. The other employees averted their eyes, unsure of how to interact with him. John, misunderstanding the awkward glances as sympathy, thought they were feeling sorry for him.
Thanks for your concern. As you can see, I'm doing just fine. So don't worry about me. Let's get back to work.
He clapped his hands to get everyone back on track. He's the head of this department. In just 7 years since switching jobs, he's rapidly climbed the ranks. From the outside, he might even appear to be a remarkable leader, holding his head high despite going through tough times.
Work? But John, you are already.
One of the younger employees mumbled awkwardly. John seemed pleased with all the attention he was getting. He allowed himself a brief smirk before quickly shrugging his shoulders and putting on a sad smile.
I'm okay now. Of course, it's sad about my daughter, but it was a sudden illness, nothing we could do. But hey, we're both in our 30s, so we still have time. The best way to move past grief is to have another child. I've got to work hard to prepare for that. Come on, let's get back to work. Time to focus.
No matter how much John tried to play the good father and boss, rallying the team, it was pointless. He was the only one who didn't understand the heavy atmosphere. I couldn't take it anymore and quietly stood up.
Wait, Julie. Why are you here?
Caught up in his self-pity, John hadn't noticed that I'd been standing in the corner of the room the whole time. He looked down awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable. Since Sarah passed, we hadn't faced each other properly. Maybe John felt some guilt, as he had been avoiding me by staying at his parents' house.
Get out of here. If my wife barges in like this, it's going to disrupt the work environment. It's making things awkward for everyone.
In response to John's quiet growl, I calmly replied, "Why should I leave? I'm not an outsider. Employees can be anywhere in the office without issue." John bit his lip. That's right. I work at the same company as John. Up until now, I had avoided his department because he didn't like us crossing paths at work. But today, I had a reason to be here. And by the way, the one who needs to leave is you, John. You're the one causing disruptions by being here.
What?
John looked up, and our eyes locked. It had been a while since I'd seen his face, and he looked as healthy as ever, not a sign of wear or exhaustion. Physically and mentally, he seemed in perfect health. You're fired. You're done, John. This company doesn't need you anymore. Leave right now.
What?
John's well-nourished, plump cheeks twitched slightly.
Fired? What do you mean? You don't have the authority to do that.
His voice, hoarse and caught in his throat, only added to his pitiful appearance. At that moment, the door opened and someone stepped into the room.
I do have the authority to fire you.
It was my dad, Michael. John, who must have already sensed the worst coming, collapsed weakly. My dad spoke slowly, deliberately, and coldly, his voice sending chills through the room.
You're fired.
The weight of my dad's words, filled with quiet rage, hit John hard, draining the color from his face. The truth is, both John and I worked for my dad's company. My mom had passed away before our marriage, and my dad, a hard-working man who never interfered in our daily lives, was my only family. For John, this distance likely felt ideal. Whenever the three of us met, my dad would always instruct me.
John is a good head of the family. He's working hard. Make sure you both support and respect each other.
John conveniently interpreted that as meaning he, as the head of the family, was the one who should be respected. In reality, my dad meant that since both of us were working hard at our jobs and raising our child, we should appreciate each other and support one another as a couple. Though my mom had passed before my marriage, my dad had adored her. He was the kind of man who would take over the dishwashing duties, claiming he didn't want my mom's hands to get rough. Without knowing this side of him, one might mistake my dad for an old-fashioned and stern patriarch. I realized that John had misinterpreted my stern, old-fashioned dad, assuming that he believed in the idea that men were superior. John convinced himself that, as a man, my dad was on his side. Because of that, John thought he could get away with treating me poorly, as long as he put on a good front in front of my dad. He naively believed it wouldn't be a problem. But reality wasn't so kind.
You're fired.
Hearing that word from the very man he trusted, John couldn't comprehend it. He glanced around, trying to escape my dad's piercing gaze, but all he found were cold stares from the other employees. The confusion from the people around, which John had mistaken as concern for him, suddenly made sense. They realized it had been a complete misunderstanding. His dismissal had already been communicated within the company. The only one foolish enough to still believe he had a place there was John himself.
This can't be.
John trembled, now cornered, his body shaking with fear. I braced myself, expecting John to desperately apologize or explain himself, but instead, he bared his teeth unexpectedly.
This is wrongful termination. Julie must have lied and made me look like the villain.
With tears in his eyes, John launched into an impassioned speech.
You're just making me the bad guy to deal with your grief over losing Sarah. Sarah died from a sudden illness, and there was nothing anyone could have done. Why does it seem like you're the victim, and I'm the one at fault? Losing a child is hard on both parents. You're not the only one suffering here.
John's voice boomed as he finished, panting from the outburst. No matter how much he shouted, it didn't shake me. You're right. I'm not the victim. Sarah is. I had already explained everything to my dad. I hadn't planned on revealing the full story to people at work, but since John brought it up, I had no choice. When Sarah had a high fever and was lethargic, I begged John to take her to the hospital. But he refused because he didn't want to spend the money. He abandoned her to save a few $1,000s. If we had gone to the hospital sooner, maybe, just maybe, Sarah would still be with us. The room buzzed with murmurs.
No, it's not my fault. It was late, and it was a long weekend. You can't just run to the hospital for a fever and waste everyone's time.
John pleaded, trying to shake off the growing contempt directed at him. But it only made things worse. John had always been good at putting on a nice front. He loved bragging about how he'd take Sarah out on fun trips. And after the weekend, he'd always say, "I'm exhausted, but it's worth it for my daughter's smile." He even liked to mention how he'd rush her to the hospital for a mild fever or minor scrape. For someone who had always painted himself as a loving family man, his excuse of it was just a fever wasn't holding up. Everyone was starting to realize that he really had abandoned his child. The position of authority John had worked so hard to build at work was crumbling beneath him. John scratched his head in frustration and stomped his feet like a child.
But I didn't realize Sarah's condition was that serious. How was I supposed to know? And now, just because of one mistake, you're kicking me out of the company? That's terrible. This is wrongful termination, abusing your power. I'm a victim too.
There are some mistakes you can never come back from. And this wasn't a personal grudge or an unfair dismissal. Everyone in the room knew the truth. John had skipped his own daughter's funeral. Many of our colleagues had come to pay their respects to Sarah, and they had all noticed John's absence. If he had been too grief-stricken to attend, maybe people would have found it in their hearts to forgive him. But the reality? People saw you, at the steakhouse, the day of Sarah's funeral, enjoying a meal.
What?
Not only did John skip the funeral, but he also went out to eat steak with his mom. He mentioned it over the phone, but it sounded so absurd that I thought he must have been joking. However, on the way back from the funeral, one of our coworkers spotted John at the steakhouse. In disbelief, they reported it to me and my dad. At that moment, I felt nothing but shame and humiliation to have someone like him as my husband.
No, that's a mistake. They must have seen someone else. I was too upset to eat anything. I couldn't possibly have eaten steak.
But John's true colors had shown, and it was a relief. He didn't deserve an ounce of sympathy. Is that so? Then explain this receipt. I waved the receipt in the air, the one John had submitted to accounting. You tried to expense this, didn't you? But it's not going to work. You didn't take a client to that steakhouse, did you? And on the day of Sarah's funeral, no less.
Oh my.
John rushed toward me to snatch the receipt, but my dad grabbed him by the shoulder. For a moment, John raised his right fist, but the watchful eyes around him kept him in check.
It seems you've been submitting personal receipts as company expenses for a while now. One of the accounting staff, unable to bear the guilt, reported it to me. They suspected your receipts for a while, but didn't dare challenge you since you're married to the future president.
My dad moved closer to John, his voice steady and cold.
You've been taking advantage of your position as my son-in-law, doing as you please. I had high hopes for you, John, but I can't let someone guilty of such misconduct take over the company. In fact, I can't even keep you employed. You're fired.
The weight of my dad's words hit John hard, and his legs trembled. John had been penny pinching, expensing personal meals and purchases. He might have enjoyed the perks for a while, but now the cost was far greater than he had imagined.
What the hell? Everyone's ganging up on me. It's just a few $1,000s for the steak, no big deal. What a stingy company. I'm done with you.
John muttered bitterly, his tough words only making him look more pitiful. No matter how much he tried to act tough, it was just pathetic. The people around him looked at him with pity, realizing what a lost cause he truly was. Feeling the pressure of having no allies, John's face turned red as he shouted,
Fine. I'm leaving.
He tried to act tough, but it was like watching a tantrum-throwing toddler. As he stomped toward the door, I called out to him, Where are you going? He spun around, eyes wide with anger.
Home.
John shouted as if it were the most natural thing in the world. It seemed like he was planning to go home and drown his sorrows in alcohol. Really? Well, if you're heading home, make sure to go back to your parents. Because our home, it's no longer yours.
What?
His once angry eyes went wide with shock. As his rage turned into confusion, I calmly delivered the truth. I sold the house. You can't go back there.
Why did you sell it without telling me?
The house we lived in had been purchased by my dad.
It was in my name. Why would it be wrong for me to sell my house?
John's face flushed with anger, his mouth opening and closing in disbelief.
What? You can't just sell the house I lived in. That's our family home. It's full of memories.
Hearing the word family come out of his mouth was utterly disgusting. The man who had destroyed our family had no right to use it as an excuse. It's exactly because the house is filled with memories that I can't live there. But someone like you, who only has superficial kindness, wouldn't understand how I feel. John was right. It was a home filled with precious memories. And that's exactly why everywhere I look, I see Sarah. Sarah, who is no longer in this world. There's no way I can continue living in the room where Sarah passed away, pretending as if nothing happened.
But I have rights too.
As John clung to his argument, I handed him a piece of paper. Divorce me.
What?
I don't need you in my life anymore. How could someone who didn't care about their own child's happiness and abandoned their responsibilities have any rights? Compared to what Sarah lost her life, John losing his job, future position, social standing, money, and house is insignificant. He cried and screamed, unable to appreciate that at least he still had his health.
Why are you doing this? Are you happy now that you've taken everything from me?
Happy? Of course not. I gave him a look of utter disdain. Realizing how foolish he looked, John, humiliated, left in a huff, muttering curses under his breath. After Sarah passed away, John realized just how much more he cared about money than his own child. After Sarah passed away, it seemed that John was initially upset and felt some sense of responsibility. Unable to face me, he ran off to his parents' house. That much I could have forgiven. But what I didn't expect was the kind of encouragement he received from his parents.
So, what's happening with Sarah's insurance money? Remember how we got that policy ages ago? I didn't think we'd need coverage for Sarah, But you couldn't say no back then. What's going on with that?
A few days after the divorce, he called me with this conversation. You want the insurance money? When I asked directly, John laughed.
Well, yeah. I mean, I should get my share, right? I wouldn't want you keeping it all to yourself without saying anything.
I was too stunned to respond. As I stayed silent, John started explaining his plan.
Thanks to you, my family's been dealing with a lot of trouble. We were actually planning to have my parents move in with us to help you, since you're so vulnerable. But then you went and sold the house without saying anything.
I didn't know about this supposed plan, but I felt relief knowing I had sold the house.
Mom was really looking forward to living together. But now, not only is the house gone, I've lost my job, and we got divorced. You really did a number on me. No severance, no alimony. At least give me the insurance money.
His voice wasn't just angry. There was panic in it too. As I began to piece it together, he tried to tug at my sympathy.
My parents' house is a rental, Getting fired was a huge shock, and I figured I could lay low at their place for a while. But then the landlord showed up, demanding they pay the overdue rent.
Apparently, his parents had been behind on rent. Maybe the landlord had been lenient because of their age, but with John crashing there, they decided to collect.
How am I supposed to pay back rent without a job?
You have savings. Even though I coldly brushed him off, I could hear John sniffle.
Yeah, but once I pay the rent, they said we'd have to move out. My savings won't be enough to cover the move.
We'd split our savings during the divorce. In exchange for me not suing him for embezzlement, John had been forced to return the money he stole from the company. Still, he should have about $10,000 left.
But you don't get it. Even though it's a rental, Dad went and remodeled the place himself. Now, we have to pay the back rent and fix the walls he tore down, the attic room he added, everything. That's going to wipe out my savings in no time.
John pleaded desperately, but I felt nothing. Come to think of it, his parents' house did have an eccentric design. It was charming in its way. I had no idea they had remodeled a rented house without permission. It was a perfect metaphor for John, nice on the outside, a disaster underneath. Like father, like son, selfish and short-sighted. The three of them can go to hell together. By the way, I was the beneficiary of Sarah's life insurance policy, the last bit of hope John clung to. At the time, I couldn't say no to the insurance, so John had complained quite a bit. That's why he had no say in it. So, you want a share of Sarah's insurance money? I was the one who took out the policy, paid for it with my savings, and I'm the beneficiary. There's no way any of this money is going to you. I ended the conversation quickly and hung up the phone. After that, John continued to call frequently, but he never had the guts to show up at the office. Maybe he still felt some shame, or perhaps he didn't want to tarnish the memory of the time when he was respected as a boss. Eventually, John's calls stopped altogether. One of the gossiping employees did some digging and found out that his parents' house had already been rented out. It seemed they had settled the overdue rent and paid more than their savings could cover for repairs before moving out. Even when I learned this, I didn't feel a shred of concern or sympathy. His present and future have nothing to do with me, and I'm not interested at all. Though I cut him off with resolve, the pain in my heart still aches. It's not as if getting rid of John brought me any sense of relief.
Julie, how about we take a day off and go somewhere together?
One day, my dad gently suggested it. After the divorce, I had moved back home, kept working as usual and lived my life as if nothing had changed. But it seemed my dad could tell that I was still feeling down.
I understand how sad you must feel. For parents, their children are more important than themselves. You always prayed for Sarah's happiness, didn't you?
My dad's kind voice was comforting.
As a parent, I just want to see you smile, Julie.
It hit me suddenly. I'm Sarah's parent, but I'm also my dad's child. When I looked up at him, he was smiling the same gentle smile I had always seen when I was a little girl.
Julie, let's go out and have fun. Just the two of us, like old times.
Yeah, Dad. The one who can truly heal me is my dad, my family.